Okay, hello everybody. My name is Brianne. This is my presentation on the lessons that I've learned working on the same game for about 2 years. I forgot to tighten this. And specifically on maintaining long-term motivation on solo projects. This is a topic that comes up a lot online, and I didn't realize I could become an expert on it until I was watching a GDC talk, and they were talking about all of the things that I had learned. And so I figured I would share all of the lessons I've learned here with my local community. So just to get started with who I am, like I said, my name is Brianne. I'm a former software engineer. I've worked as a software engineer. I didn't necessarily love it as much as I thought I would, and so I've kind of taken an indefinite hiatus from that. I'm also a competitive fighting game player. If you go to any fighting game tournaments in Utah, you'll probably see me or some friends of mine there. And most importantly for this presentation, I'm the developer and creator of Labyrinths of Elfheim, which is a couch co-op tower defense game about building mazes. It has a demo, and all of you should download it. Okay. Here's a QR code. There's a link to it. I can also post a link in the Discord again. But if you want to see just kind of the results of my work in a playable, somewhat polished state that's continuously being improved upon, you can download it. I like to follow the academic style of writing for presentations, where the first thing that I do is essentially define the domain of the problem. I think it's kind of useless to describe a solution unless there's a decent understanding of what the problem actually is. So that's what I'm going to start with, is defining the problem domain. Then I'm going to describe the solution in this order of building a good foundation, what tasks to prioritize, idle XP gain, externalization, playtesting and social interaction, and keeping track of your own mental well-being. So here is the problem domain. I want to give other people a way to recreate my happy childhood memories, TM, for themselves. I grew up playing a lot of Warcraft 3 custom maps, and Warcraft 3 is really starting to show its age. Like, development on that game started in like 98. I think that's when the first trailer for it released, and it came out in like 2001. So getting family together for LAN parties on Warcraft 3 gets harder and harder and harder every year. So I don't have enough money to hire other people to make a game to recreate my happy childhood memories. And the real world gets in the way sometimes, where life happens. And so how is it that we can accomplish this first goal with these two things that are standing in the way of accomplishing that goal? And if I had to summarize it in a single sentence, it would be experiment heavily with your workflow organization and take care of yourself. However, no game and its success can be divorced from the process and the people that went into making that game. So this asterisk is, all of this worked for me, and we are not the same person, but I hope that by giving you enough context about why certain things worked for me, you're able to adopt certain pieces of advice that you'll find useful for yourself and leave behind the things that won't work for you because of the differences in our situation or the differences in who we are as people. So starting off with a good foundation. Labyrinths was not the first game that I tried to make. I've been trying to make games since high school, and every single one of them has failed. I've tried making a stealth survival platformer. I've tried making a co-op dungeon crawler. I've tried making a fighting game. That one failed the worst. So what I looked up online was, what is the commonality between all successful games? And what all successful games have essentially is a design doc. It's very focused, it's very precise, it's very specific about what should go into the game and what should not go into the game. So if you are just getting started, a short, concise design doc lets you succeed quickly. If you describe a core gameplay loop and build a game that is just that core gameplay loop, you have succeeded. Here is what the initial version of my design doc looked like. It's collaborative maze building tower defense. I specify that I'm going to use hexagon tiles. Warcraft 3 uses a square grid system, which makes like corner navigation weird. And there's not a good way to have like a fully optimized maze because it is suboptimal at its most base level, so I wanted hexagon tiles. And then there's a mechanic described on here of linking different mazes together that comes from the original Warcraft 3 map this is based on. However, that was left behind when I figured out it wasn't fun. So my other piece of success that I identified in myself is having a very visual design doc. Helps you occupy the perspective of the player and what the player is going to see when they start playing the game. If you aren't able to make a design doc that has visual components to it, that idea may need some more time in the oven for you to be successful with it. But if you can summarize it in just a couple of short images, you're probably ready to get started on it. So the next thing in having a solid foundation is I knew how to program because I'd been working as a software engineer. I knew nothing about game development. So what I did is I searched online for a tutorial of make a tower defense in Godot, and I copied the tutorials from start to finish. It was 3 hours of videos. And by the end of it, I had a game that worked. I could press the build button and send that build to people, and they could play it, which was really nice to have starting out. Within a week of starting, I had a core gameplay loop. I had a lot of my core mechanics in place, a lot of core systems, and I always had this place of functionality that I could return to. I think one of the most demoralizing things about solo development is when you get to the point of you just want the game to work and it doesn't work for the first time. That is probably the time when most projects are going to fail, is if you can't make your game run once. So what I would recommend for having a good foundation is making a very small version of the game and then modifying that. It's a lot easier to modify something than to build something from scratch. So if you have a sourdough starter, if you have the right sourdough starter, it's much easier to have everything on top of that instead of trying to make one giant sourdough at a time, if that makes sense. You gotta have a seed that grows into something. You can't just have a giant plant. It has to start from something. And then growing on top of the foundation, something that you'll run into is, or something that I identified for myself as a place where I could have quit, but I'm glad I didn't, was when I outpaced YouTube tutorials and very easy to digest instructions on how to build the thing that I wanted to build. Once I outgrew that and I had to start digging into the engine documentation for Godot itself, I was very glad that I let myself dig into the documentation and learn how to read the documentation, so that wasn't something that killed my motivation. Was I'm out of tutorials, the game doesn't exist yet as I want it to, sucks to suck, I guess. And then the last part of kind of growing on your foundation is a little note on programmer art. The less art that you have to make at the very beginning, the better, in my opinion. There's a website called kenny.nl, which I'm sure, raise your hand if you're familiar with the website. Thumbs up if it's a good resource. Okay, kenny.nl has fantastic placeholder art. It's high quality. It will often include the original mesh data or the original SVGs for everything that is pixel art. An example of how that really saved me a lot of time is I didn't know what tile size to pick. So I just downloaded the tiles from kenny.nl. Everything fit around that tile size, and that's what the game is built on top of. That saved me a ton of time. So to summarize, just having a good solid foundation, start small and focused with templates and or high quality tutorials. We good? Does this make sense so far? Cool. So now when we have arrived at this hypothetical point of you have the first version of your game, and it's not, it works, you have your core gameplay loop, but it's not your finalized game. How do you decide how to spend your time in between these two moments? What I learned is that motivation is your most precious fuel. There's kind of like the iron triangle of like time, quality, and cost. In solo development, most of the time what you have is time, not necessarily money. And in order to utilize that time, you have to have motivation backing it. So how I maintained motivation was essentially always working on the things where the game mechanics emerged from that were very visible changes. I recognize like I'm kind of in a lucky position of having lots of people who are willing to play test my game, from roommates to members of the fighting game community and things like that, where if I have a very visual change and I sit that down in front of someone, they'll notice it, and their excitement about that existing feeds me motivation and creates this really positive feedback loop. So yeah, other things in terms of like how I prioritize tasks is at the very beginning, I would make sure that at the end of a session of like working on the game, it would build and like compile correctly. Having a game broken for multiple days in a row kills your motivation. It ruins it because the longer that a bug exists, you're losing mental context about like why that bug exists. You're losing mental context about like the solutions that you've tried. There's kind of a point of insanity where you're trying to do the same thing like multiple days in a row that's really, really demoralizing. So sometimes prioritizing a smaller problem is a great way to build your motivation back up to work on those bigger problems again. Another thing is just setting very small goals that I could accomplish quickly. I've never necessarily had the goal of publishing my game. I've just had the goal of having a game to play with friends. Ultimately, like Labyrinth is a very social game. And by not setting this very lofty goal of publishing, but instead having the goal of playing my game with other people, I have a goal that I've been succeeding on for 2 years rather than like, I'm waiting years and years to succeed. I'm allowing myself to succeed by having a different measurement of success for myself. So there's kind of just this engine that happens of, I have my motivation through effort. If I accomplish something, that feeds me additional motivation. And you can create this, perpetual flywheel for yourself. So be very cautious of putting in more effort than you have motivation for, and make sure that you are, you identify essentially the link between what you've accomplished and how it's feeding you motivation, and kind of introspect if that feels off at all. So instead of necessarily managing your project to accomplish something, try managing the order that you accomplish tasks or tickets on your project in the order that will give you the most motivation. This has worked way better for me than like, I need to finish this thing. It's the most important thing. Next, I want to talk about something that I coined like idle XP gain. It's really exhausting to sit down in front of the editor all of the time and just spend all of your time like staring at the same thing that doesn't work for a long time. Oh dang it, that was supposed to animate, so it wasn't just all at once. There's this very famous quote with a long and complicated attribution history, which is, learn from the mistakes of others. You can't live long enough to make all of them yourself. Something that I try really hard to intentionally do is not spend all of my learning time in the editor, learning engine tools or like learning engine components. I try really, really hard to broaden my horizons and make sure that I'm learning from the mistakes of other people. So GDC, if you're not like subscribed to GDC and you're not like constantly consuming GDC, consider as such. It is the premier industry event. The amount of knowledge that is just freely shared from GDC is incredibly valuable. There's been a recent trend now that video games are becoming as old of a medium as they are, where senior industry members will start YouTube channels and talk about their experiences. So my two favorites are Masahiro Sakurai, who's the series director of Super Smash Bros., and Mark Dara, who's a former executive producer and narrative designer at BioWare. They both have like stylistically, these two are very, very different. Like Masahiro Sakurai is incredibly focused, incredibly precise. Every video has a specific message that he wants to get out before he even like sits down to film anything. Whereas Mark Dara will essentially just like do playthroughs of the BioWare games and be like, oh yeah, there's this lesson that I learned here. There's this thing that happened here. Another thing, as far as like maximizing your time outside of the editor, I try really, really hard to consume a lot of games criticism and journalism. At the top of that list, I would put GMTK, or Game Maker's Toolkit. It's a YouTube channel that does like games journalism and games criticism from the perspective of game design. He has an excellent series of videos called Boss Keys, which is all about like, yeah, I'm seeing some nodding in the audience. He has an excellent series called Boss Keys, which is all about how different games approach like having locks and keys to access like different parts of the game as you progress through them. Things like Hollow Knight, Zelda games, Metroid games, things like that. There are some fun video essayists like Rasputin. Core A Gaming is a very fighting game focused one. It'll change your life if you watch Core A Gaming videos. And then last on this list are two British people. There's James Stephanie Sterling and Josh Strife Hayes. Josh Strife Hayes does content surrounding MMOs, which is a genre that I haven't touched since elementary school. But I love listening to the way that he describes them because he has a background in education. And so he combines his educational background with like a genre that I've never touched before and like really opened my horizons about like the different ways that people other than me experience and enjoy video games. And then there's James Stephanie Sterling. She is a journalist with a really interesting past. She was essentially blackballed from the industry when she reported on Activision Blizzard's widespread misconduct. And so she has all of the training and former like industry connections of like a professional games journalist, but has to live on the outside because she was blackballed due to high amounts of integrity. And so they have very interesting perspectives that I just have really expanded my worldview. And then just overall, seek out genre discussion, critique and discussion outside of your familiarity. It's a great way to do the top thing of like learning from the mistakes of others. Like learning about the different mistakes that like unsuccessful MMOs have done, even though I don't care about the genre, has really helped me with my own projects. So, and perhaps nail into your like psyche that productivity does not equal time spent in the editor. Sometimes you do need time away from direct productivity in order to make progress. Sometimes like the missing key to the thing that you're working on is hearing about something completely different. So yeah. Next I want to talk about externalization. I have this thing that me and my therapist called noise in my brain, which is where I just have like 10 different ideas all competing for attention, and they all have value, they all have merit. There's something good about every single one of them. But by the presence of all 10 of them at the same time, they become a problem. So the way to fix noise, and from my experience, a lot of other creative people experience noise, the way you fix that problem is through externalization, writing down what those ideas are, interrogating those ideas, what they're trying to tell you, and things like that. So a trick that I learned at a writing conference when I was in like high school is the drawer of new shinies. It's how a lot of authors will stay focused on what they're working on, which is inevitably you'll be weeks or months deep into a project and you'll have this fantastic idea for this other project. You're like, oh my gosh, I should abandon all of this, work on the new shiny thing. The trick that I learned was to never actually work on the new shiny thing, but write down as much about it as you can without crossing the threshold into creating it. So how this works is every time I get a fun idea, I write it down. I never open the editor for them. At most, I'll make a mock-up in Blender if I can't get the idea to essentially like stop bothering me without making a mock-up of it. And if the idea is longer than 2 paragraphs, it moves out of the gameideas.doc and it gets its own document. So an example is I had this fun idea for a platforming-focused MMO with more of a play model similar to like a Minecraft server or like Borderlands campaign co-op. And I had some fun ideas about it, but the thing is it just kept giving me like, you should have this thing, you should have this thing. And so it has its own document now describing the network architecture, describing different like puzzle things, describing how the class system would work, how the item system would work, and things like that. I never opened the Godot editor for this, but by writing down all of these things, it has quieted the noise in my brain where I can focus on labyrinths. And I know if I ever get to the point where I do want to work on this, I haven't lost anything. Because the reason the noise happens is because the ideas that you have will be afraid that they're forgotten. So if you write them down, your ideas lose the quality of being afraid of being forgotten, and it just lets you like focus on everything else. The other thing is I don't just work in Godot. I'm also writing a book that I'm about 16,000 words into, the one that I accidentally opened when I tried to open my speaking notes earlier. And having different creative outlets essentially lets you exercise the different parts of your brain. You know, if we use a gym analogy for exercise, if all you did was bicep curls every day, your body would hate you. Your biceps would stop getting stronger, you would start to develop repetitive stress injuries, and your body would hate you. But by doing bicep curls one day, tricep presses a different day, leg day a different day, it allows you to exercise different parts of your body and allow those parts of your body to heal and work themselves individually the way that they're supposed to. So similarly, when I'm working on my book, I'll go, wow, this is a really new, shiny, fun idea for a different book. I have a different document for my new, shiny, fun book idea so that I can stay focused on my one book and my one game. The other thing is externalization doesn't apply to just things outside of your main project. It'll apply to things inside of your main project too. So it doesn't necessarily matter what tool you use to organize all of the noise for your project, as long as it works. Usually you need something, though, that is a little bit less stiff and less formatted than a Word document. So I use Trello with 4-ish columns to organize essentially the noise in my brain about labyrinths. The first one are my active tickets. These are the things that I'm working on. I'm spending time in the editor on them. I'm making solid progress on them. I'm writing updates to myself. I have my active backlog, which are tickets where I need to research what needs to happen for them, whether I need an asset creation pipeline, whether I need to understand a tool the engine gives me a little bit more, whether I need to do like market research, those kind of things. I have my finished but may need touch-up. This is once an active ticket is finished, I'm not ready to archive it yet. Usually I'll need to do bug testing, balance testing, other things like that. So I don't want to, this is essentially like the last place that a ticket goes before an idea is ready to be forgotten, because the idea is fully fleshed out in the game itself. And then I have my actual backlog. These are all of the tickets where I'm like, I have no idea when I'm going to work on these, but I'm writing them down so I don't forget them, and I can just keep all of my attention focused on the actual matters at hand. So the lesson I would kind of summarize all of this as is work with and not against your untamable creative energy. Sort of the great curse of having creativity is you're constantly having ideas, and by using the new shiny drawer trick, it allows you to continuously like let your creative energy come forward, but not be like a detriment to accomplishing your actual goals. Let's talk a little bit about playtesting. So playtest as much as possible, as early as possible. This is an ethos that is preached by all of the biggest, successfulest game studios in the world. Playtesting works a little bit differently for solo developers. And so something that you'll find is that you start to play your game the right way, where it's like if you run into a bug, you'll start to subconsciously like avoid that bug of just like, yeah, I know that bug exists. I need to go work on that other thing. and then you'll set your game down in front of someone else, and they do not have the context to care, and they'll cause a memory overflow. My favorite example of this is in my game, after you pick all of your characters, there's a button that you can press that loads in the game session itself and like sets up, all the characters, all of the signals, and all the connections between things. But if you press that button, it didn't make the button go away. So I had a friend where he was like, it's not working, and he just mashed the button on his controller over and over again until like my game that takes up like 80 megabytes of VRAM on a good day or on a bad day completely shut down the system that it was on because so many overlapping game sessions just spawned in all at the same time. So, but that was the thing where I was like, yeah, I know that I should only press the button once. Other people do not care. If you have a Steam Deck, get this. This is an incredible piece of free software. If you put your Steam Deck into developer mode, this is a tool that you can launch inside of Steam itself that will let you upload titles. If you need to build your title on the Steam Deck, you can do that through here. If you need to take screenshots, if you need to record video, you can do all of that remotely from inside of this, this tool. It is invaluable. It is as plug and play as the other day, I reworked a mechanic for one of my characters. I opened this up after like exporting a build. I pressed upload title, and I took my Steam Deck to my roommate and I said, hey, I need you to play as Icarus and see if anything breaks. It was that easy. So get this. It makes it easy to always have like an up-to-date build that you can carry with you. Literally like last night as I was like going to bed, I was like, oh yeah, I need to like upload a build so that when I take my Steam Deck to the meetup tomorrow, I have an up-to-date build. Super convenient. I have a friend who works at Bungie doing QA for Destiny 2. And when I showed this to him, he was like, yeah, that's basically what we have at Bungie. And it's free as long as you have a Steam Deck. But going back to this idea of like playtesting as much as possible, the root causes of most of my most egregious bugs were found by my friends. I have a document on my computer where I keep track of like the bugs that my friends have found. Every time I like fix a bug, I'll like take a screenshot and send it to my friend and be like, thank you for finding this for me. Like I really, really appreciate it. I've been scratching my head about this for months, and you sat down and you found it immediately. So another thing that I do as far as like playtesting, I have 2 wired controllers that I take with me almost everywhere. Because they're wired controllers, I don't have to worry about connectivity issues. I don't have to worry about charging them. I don't have to worry about a lot of things. They suck. They were like $10 at Smith's a few years ago, but they don't break. However, there's a lucky coincidence with playing fighting games and the way that my game is set up, where I designed the layout of my game to work on a single Joy-Con, where you have a single analog input and 6 buttons. Coincidentally, when I'm going to fighting game tournaments, most people only have a controller with a single analog input and between 6 and 8 buttons, which means anywhere that I take my, if I take my game to a fighting game tournament, people can just plug in their own controller and just play with me. And I can get very, very low effort feedback from people on controllers that they're familiar with. Another thing is fighting game players find exploits and broken mechanics very quickly. This is like one of those like asterisks, like I am me, not everyone is in the fighting game community. But there's a skill that you develop when you play fighting games where you look for the broken shit as quickly as possible. And it's a skill that you can develop over time. And so sometimes like I'll just set it down, like I'll give my game to a fighting game friend and they'll read through the descriptions of the towers and they're like, oh yeah, so if I do this, maximum damage. I'm like, you're correct. So anyway, if you're not in the fighting game community, it's probably worth like retaining the friendship of someone who is really good at video games to get that perspective in addition to just regular Joe Schmo, all of us. But kind of the core lesson of like playtesting and everything from here is keeping your game in a shareable state invites low effort collaboration. A lot of the reasons that people will become solo developers is because you can't get people to care in the same quantities, in the same ways that you can about your game for a long enough period of time. And so, because if you don't have enough money to hire other people, you're relying on people's own intrinsic motivation to continue to feed them that forward. But if you keep your game in a shareable state and give it to other people, they can give you excellent playtesting feedback. They can hunt for bugs for you. They can find the solution, like the causes of your bugs for you. And it's a great way to distribute some of the isolating work of doing solo game dev with other people. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is essentially your mental well-being, because motivation can be a very fickle resource. It is more fickle if you don't have good mental well-being. So similar to journaling, similar to the externalization that I talked about with your drawer of new shinies, with keeping track of your tickets and features and bugs and things like that. If you also journal your thoughts when you can't focus, you can sometimes get out your more personal feelings and then have a clean mental working slate for your game. Another thing is to recognize burnout as a warning sign of mental injury. So the way that I talked about, if you only exercise doing bicep curls, you're going to get a repetitive stress injury. My theory is that burnout is essentially a mental repetitive stress injury. If you feel burnout coming on, you need to analyze that feeling, figure out where it's coming from, and make appropriate adjustments so that you don't more deeply injure yourself and keep you from working on your own game. Go to therapy. Creation isn't therapy, therapy is therapy. A lot of times I feel like creativity emerges from an exploration of dissonance, where it's either there's these two ideas that should be, or feel like they should be separate, but I keep finding them coming together, or there's these two ideas that should be opposed to each other that are overlapping in some ways. Therapy gives you the coping mechanisms and the skills to work through those things with real problems, whereas creativity allows you to essentially explore dissonance rather than resolve it. And yeah, if you're not taking care of yourself, motivation is a lot harder to find. And then kind of the last thing here is spend significant time away from your workstation with the people that you cherish. Even though when your game is finished, more people will probably know the title of your game than who you are as a person. That immortality doesn't exist in your head in the same way. I think the most precious thing that we have here on Earth are the connections that we have with other people. And working on your game to the point of becoming a detriment to the relationships that you have with the people most precious to you, I think is counterproductive to the joy of game development, essentially. And for example, for myself, when we hit the month of June and Street Fighter 6 released, I took a full month break from working on Labyrinths. I was like, all I'm doing is playing Street Fighter 6 with my friends. I'm never opening the Godot editor for the entire month of June. And I'm so glad that I did, because that break gave me just so much joy from spending the time with the people that I love, and giving myself that break made it where I just felt no shame about not working on my game at all. And the last thing is, life is too short to be miserable. If working on your game isn't making you happy, if working on your game is making you miserable, introspect, analyze, figure out why that's the case, and see if it's just you need to make an adjustment in how the game dev process is going, or if you need to make a different game, or if you need to just take a break from game dev. So to summarize all of this, James Stephanie Sterling said this very famous quote. She repeats it in a lot of her videos about crunch culture and publisher abuse of employees and things like that, which is that no game or piece of art is ever worth anyone's sanity ever. This is true for your art that you create for yourself. It is not worth your sanity. It should be something that makes you happy. So rather than ending on a downer, though, I'll go ahead and summarize. Taking care of yourself makes everything easier. Build the core gameplay loop and modify that game. Spend time away from the editor to learn and recharge, and make sure that making your game makes you happy. And that is my presentation on how I worked on the same game for 2 years. I would love to answer questions. Yes.
I had a very similar for the past years as well. And I have had a lot of trouble finding places. Do you have advice on how to do that?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that you can do, and to repeat the question for anyone who didn't hear it, how do you find playtesters? I think that, so yeah, the first thing is just like find spaces where people like playing games. Like a Game Dev Meetup is a good one. Another one is like sometimes board game nights or co-working nights or things like that. Another thing is you have to be careful to not ask your friends too many times. Something that I try to like mentally keep track of is like how much the game has changed since like X person played it. And if the game has changed a significant amount since that one friend played it, I can explain like, yeah, there's this new mechanic, there's this new tower, there's this new character, there's a new map. I can specify like all of those things, and so there's a reason for them to playtest now. Another thing is like, I didn't want to say like have friends, because that's not like a good piece of advice. But yeah, if you have friends who play video games, that's usually the easiest place to find playtesters. I do recognize like being in the fighting game community and not only having like friends who like play games, but like competitively play games and like practice and practice and practice. Like that is a point of privilege where it's like, I have a lot of people who love playing video games in my life. So did that answer your question, or did you have like something more specific from that? Okay.
The comments on that, if you have like friends who have kids or anything like that, kids are a lot more willing to play the game over and over, and it's like, especially if you speak into like, hey, like, if you play my game again and again, I'll give you $5. Why you'll pay me to play a video game? Not really well.
The other thing is, so on the topic of like kids playing games, not only do they not have like the context of like, you know, where your bugs are and how to play around them, they have like negative context about how to like not break things. So like kids are really good at breaking things, and so sometimes like, oh shoot, software engineers help me. It's like destructive testing or like chaos testing. What's that called? That testing methodology where it's like, you basically just like have a testing suite that walks into the barbershop and says like, fuck my shit up. What's the methodology term for that? I swear it's like chaos testing or something. Anyway, kids are chaos testers. They're like, I'm gonna press like button combinations you have never dreamed of, and you better hope that your input handler doesn't like just crap the bed. It is just chaos engineering. Okay. There's like a fun fan theory that like in Dexter's laboratory, like Dee Dee, the reason he lets her like into the lab at all is for chaos testing. But, so it's like Dee Dee from Dexter's, yeah, anyway. Other questions? I'm more than happy to keep going. What's up?
I was just going to add a comment on that one. So, like you obviously mentioned the fighting game community, there are a lot of other competitive groups, right? So, like, right? There's other communities that just fighting games that will do the exact same thing, where they're trying to min-max things, and they're trying to pick your game to show you just how broken.
Mm-hmm. So, I am targeting for games that people don't realize how to do. I had trouble.
Come talk to me afterward. There's something I'm not comfortable saying on stream, but I will talk to you about in person. Okay, other questions? Yes?
What about your board game move idea?
Uh-huh.
I feel like a lot of the time I have like board game moves and everything that kind of like attaches on me, like all of the
Mm-hmm.
but I want to have that one simple guiding document. How do I decide what should go into my board game and what should be left as like, this is just a feature?
I think that's a great question. So I'm going to answer it anecdotally. So the Freddie Mercury movie that came out a couple of years ago, starring Rami Malek, The way that they shot that movie was the massive, massive concert at the end was the first thing that they shot. Because if that scene in the movie didn't work, it wasn't worth making the rest of it. So if you don't have like the climax of that movie, none of the drama, none of the buildup, none of the tension makes any sense to have. So how I would like answer that less anecdotally is if all you had was boxes in a 2 or 3D grid, what are the mechanics that those boxes would need without any fluff for the fun of your game to emerge? One answer about that, like another anecdote about that, is the original version of Splatoon, which was made by Nintendo, literally just had like boxes that could detect like the color of the thing that they were on and change the color of the thing that they were on and chase each other around. And they figured out that like it was fun at that point, and so it was worth putting in all of the extra effort of like art design and different types of weapons and things like that. So maybe see if you can condense a lot of different variations onto mechanic and work in one core representation of that mechanic. So like in my case, my game originally only had one tower, one character, and one map. And now it has 5 characters with between 3 and 4 towers each, with like complex mechanics of like giving buffs to adjacent towers, different types of projectiles that they can launch, different particle effects, different status effects, different other things like that. The original version of my game was actually like the thing that I did to know that my game was going to be fun was I had a grid and a character that I could move around. And when I pressed a button, it would change that grid to either exist or not exist on the navigation mesh. This is back when I was using a nav mesh. And then I could press a different button and a tank would start at the beginning and try to walk to the end. And if I could change the path that the tank would take along the place, this might make more sense if you saw like the demo for the game. But if I could like change the path and like dynamically change how the tank wanted to get to the end, then I knew my game was like worth making because that was fun. Another thing is I did kind of cheat with my core gameplay loop where like tower defense games have a very like well-defined like genre trope of like you build your towers, they attack things, through killing things you get money to make more towers. Where my game differs from that is the heavy focus on the players make the path exclusively with the towers that they place. So I know this was kind of meandering, I gave a lot of anecdotes, but do you feel like you have a better answer for your question? Cool. We'll go you and then you. Sure, yeah, go ahead.
I'm really big on core pillars for your game.
Mm-hmm.
Thing that defines the game is not adding a lot of stuff. It's taking things away.
Yeah, that's another good way to put it. It's just like, what can you subtract until your game doesn't exist anymore? So yeah, what were you going to say? Mm-hmm.
They're often a good source of modern perspective of what's the new core gameplay that they're adding. Look at like, for example, Skyrim. Like, I want a new mechanic in Skyrim. I hate how the shield works.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That could be your core gameplay loop, and then you actually implement it in another game
Mm-hmm.
by modding it. If it works, and then go, I really like this. I'm going to try to make this a whole game out of that.
Yeah.
That's a good way of testing it. You've already got a game into the works. You've already got a whole system.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. There's actually a point that I forgot to make during my presentation, which was by having a functional tower defense game that I was building on top of, the past 2 years have basically just felt like I'm modding a game. Technically, I'm modding my own game, but like that's sort of the point I was trying to get to is like have a very, very small core thing that you can sit everything on top of, because building a mod is a lot easier than building a game. So try and make the game as small as possible. But yeah. Any other comments or questions or anything like that before we go into the demo portion of the evening? Any feedback on the presentation? Was it bright and yellow and pink enough?
Very good.
Thank you.